Good evening. You can be opening your Bibles to Esther chapter 2. And as we continue our Sunday night series in the book of Esther, this is where we will fester. Our God is so great that He can take our shortcomings and our failures and difficult circumstances in our life and weave together from all of that something beautiful. Romans 8:28-29 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. For those whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, in order that He might be the firstborn among many brothers." This passage in Romans 8 is a very famous one. And it's not saying that everything that happens in your life is good. In the context, Romans 8 talks about tribulation and distress and poverty and all these things that could cause you to think that maybe God doesn't love me. And in all of that, we're conquerors and nothing can separate us from the love of God. In the context, the audience is going through lots of difficulties, but he says here that all things work together for good, not that all things are good. You can think about this in your own life. Difficult circumstances that you've gone through, and maybe in those situations you always haven't responded to those things exactly how you should have. But somehow, some way, as you sought to love God the best you could in those moments, you can look back at them and go, wow, I didn't handle everything the best way. The circumstances were terrible, but I kept trying to figure out how to serve the Lord, and through it all, God wove something together that was beautiful. And of course, none of that justifies the wrongs that maybe we've committed when things were difficult. But in the book of Esther, we have that principle in play. I think sometimes we can make the mistake of looking at Esther and just assuming that she handles everything perfectly. She's going through horrifying circumstances. And in those horrifying circumstances, we can find her responding to some of these things in at least questionable ways. But the Lord is the one that we see in this book. Even though He's never named in the book of Esther, we see the Lord weaving something beautiful together. Now, in this lesson, we're going to be looking at chapter 2, and I just want to point out that in chapter 1 there is a time marker, in chapter 2 there is a time marker. In Esther chapter 1, verse 3, it was the third year of King Ahasuerus or Xerxes. And then in Esther 2:16, it's going to say that it was the 7th year of his reign. So at least between 1:3 and 2:16, there's a 4-year gap. I don't think that the beginning of this chapter is in the 7th year. I think we build up to that as this chapter continues. But in between chapters 1 and 2, Xerxes or Ahasuerus had gone against Greece and lost a battle. And that's when the Spartans had their famous 300 people that held them up and all that sort of thing. And so after Xerxes has lost a battle, he seeks, I think, to comfort himself. Have you ever had a time before where you had some humiliating defeat in your life, and the way that you sought to comfort yourself are not the ways you should have comforted yourself? The way that we can outline this chapter is in verses 1 through 4, Xerxes' men are going to give him a proposal. Verses 5 through 7 is going to give you the background of Esther and Mordecai. 8 through 18, Esther will be selected as the queen. And then at the end of the chapter, Mordecai is going to save Xerxes. Now let me say at the beginning of this lesson, this chapter is hard to preach, because the book of Esther is a cohesive story. And there's a couple things that are going to be brought up in this chapter that are very important for later on in the book. But because we're looking at chapter 2, there are certain things that we just kind of have to hold into our minds for the next lessons on Esther. With that being said, there's going to be several things that are still worthy of our attention for application just as we look at this chapter. But let's begin with this proposal that happens in Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. All right, as we start looking at what's happening here, you've got the king's young men. Notice that the text says that they were the young men. This is not wisdom from older, wiser people. And they come to Xerxes when he's not as angry anymore, but Xerxes has remembered what happened to Vashti, his wife, in chapter 1. Maybe he's missing her. There's some questions about all that sort of thing. But he's not hot with anger right now. And so they want to give this idea to Xerxes, and the idea is, all right, Xerxes, how about we search for beautiful young virgins? That's the only thing that we're really looking for. They've got to be beautiful, they've got to be young, and they've got to be virgins. That's really all the criteria that we need. And the text says that they're going to be sought out and gathered. You don't get the sense at all here that this is the kind of thing that fathers of their daughters are going to willingly offer up their daughters as potentials for this. It seems like this is something that they're going out and looking door to door, seeing who would qualify, and taking those people along. Almost like this is human trafficking is more what this sounds like. Now, when Xerxes is presented with this idea, with the end of verse 4, we have to think about what this says for just a moment. This pleased the king. And you could think from a worldly perspective of this king, yeah, of course this idea would please a king like this. For him to agree to this is for him to begin ruining the lives of many women. And if we're looking at a possibility of 4 years of searching out for the right woman, there's 1,460 days in 4 years. The high estimate is that this green lighting here is going to ruin that many women's lives. And we'll see why as we go through this chapter. He's going to have a night with every one of these women, and then he's going to choose the one that he wants. You know what we learn from, and I think that would be a high estimate though, but it's possible that it could be as many as that many people. You know what we learn from this is that self-centered people ruin the lives of other people. And because this chapter is showing something like human trafficking, you could almost equate this with sex trafficking. And there's been more and more things in the news the last few years about how that's maybe more common than people had realized before. And in this case, this is governmental officials allowing and encouraging these things to happen. Now, I don't know that that's any of our temptation, but maybe there would be smaller ways that we might be acting like Xerxes. Have you ever known men who have no problem causing other people to no longer be virgins, but when they think about settling down and getting married, they better be a virgin? How hypocritical is that? What about people that, maybe it wouldn't be something as extreme as what we're seeing in this chapter, but people that selfishly take their hobbies and their interests, and I'm going to pursue these things above the neglect of other responsibilities that I have in my life. The default way that we look at everything is from a selfish perspective. You know those days where you're done with work and you have to go to the grocery store and you get that cart that keeps pulling to the right and it's really annoying, and other people are in this shopping area and it's really frustrating that you're surrounded by all these people, and then you're in line and the person that's checking everybody out, or it's those robot things that never work and the person has to go, and you're having to deal with all of these frustrating things, and that's you driving in your car, looking at your phone when you're bored, doing all the things that everything you do is from your perspective. And unless we're careful and unless we analyze the way we think about things, we are self-centered people, and we have to ask ourselves, what are the small ways that I'm hurting other people with my self-centeredness? We don't have the power that Xerxes had, but I would reckon that if we had the power that Xerxes had, we might greenlight the same thing. And yes, I just used the word reckon. This is the proposal that's going to launch Esther becoming the queen. So then we get the background of Esther and Mordecai in verses 5 through 7. Look at verses 5 through 7 in this text. Now there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai, the name of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle. For she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when his father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. All right, now as we begin looking at these two characters, this section in verses 5 through 7 is almost a parenthetical that just helps us understand the trajectory of what's happening in this chapter. Esther is introduced here as somebody who's had a very difficult life. I take it that she was born into exile. She had heard things about Jerusalem. And her parents had died. We don't get any details on how that happened. Have you ever known people who, at a young age, both of their parents died? Can you imagine the heartbreak that would be? And when we start to compare this to other passages in the Bible, like Psalm 68, verse 5, God is introducing himself as the father of the fatherless and protector of widows, is God in his holy habitation. You start to look at other passages in the Bible and you think, Esther is the kind of person that the Lord will take care of. And we're going to see that as we go through this. But did you notice that in verse 7, she's described as somebody with a beautiful figure and lovely to look at? The writer is showing us that she's obviously going to be the one that's going to be selected to be the next queen. You realize that being beautiful is not always a blessing? That sometimes being really beautiful sets you up to be the kind of person that guys are going to try to seek to use and abuse. She's got the curse of beauty, you could almost say. There's another detail that's given about her in this, is that she's got two names. The only person in the book of Esther with two names. Hadassah is the Hebrew name that she has, which means myrtle. Esther is the Persian name that she has, which means star. And it's fitting that she's the only person in Esther with two names, because she's going to struggle to have these dual identities. She's trying to figure out how to live in the Persian Empire, and there's going to be a lot of Persian morality that we're going to see from her. But she's also trying to live as an Israelite, as a Jew, and we're going to have to see which one's going to win out. And the trajectory of the book is that she's going to grow into becoming somebody that she should become. Which, by the way, sounds like a lot of our stories. Do you ever struggle with two different identities? You're around one group of people and you talk a certain way, you act a certain way, and then you're around God's people and you talk a certain way and act a certain way, and eventually there comes a time in your life when you've got to decide which one's going to win. The book of Esther is much more relatable than perhaps we've thought before. But that's Esther. We're also introduced to a guy named Mordecai in this same section, and Marduk is one of the Persian gods, or Babylonian gods, and it's like he's been named after this Persian god. Maybe he was born in exile, but in this text, he is his ancestry is connected with other people, and it mentions Kish. Remember who Kish is related to? Back in 1 Samuel 9, 1 and 2, there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Becheroth, son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a man of wealth, and he had a son whose name was Saul. Now there's questions on how far back did Mordecai's ancestry go with regards to who was taken into exile. Was Mordecai taken into exile? Was he born into exile? We don't have all the details of that given. I think he was probably born there. But for whatever that's worth, what this is setting up here is that if Mordecai is associated with Saul, we're going to see another guy later in this book named Haman who's associated with the Amalekites, and Saul was commanded to take out the Amalekites, and we're going to see this battle continuing that Saul had never finished. That's one of those things as we look at this chapter that we have to hold until a future chapter. So just try to remember that. But notice what else we learn about Mordecai in this text. In verse 7, he's raising Esther as his own daughter after her parents died. All right, so there we go. There's the introduction to the woman that's going to become the queen and the guy that's taking care of her. Quick little side point. Have you ever seen like an archaeological study Bible before? If you don't have one of those, they're worth getting. Because they show all these different stories in the Bible and how there's been archaeological discoveries that show that these stories really happened, even though we didn't need the archaeology to figure that out. But I got a quote from a study Bible that shows something like this. There's a tablet near Babylon that mentions a scribe by the name of Mardukiah. He was an accountant or minister at the court of Susa in the early years of Xerxes. Many interpreters identify him with Mordecai, very possibly this being the same guy. So the people that we're reading about in this book, there's archaeological records that show that Xerxes was a real king, that he had somebody named Mordecai or a name similar to that serving him. But let's go back to what's happening now. These orders have been sent out to go search and find somebody that would be a candidate for Xerxes. Look at verses 8 through 11. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young women pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. All right. We don't get all the details on this, but for one reason or another, Esther is just really impressing Hegai, and he sets her at the front of the harem. He gives her 7 other women that can help take care of her and all this sort of thing. Kind of reminds you of Joseph in a foreign land rising to the top. But do you see any concerns with Esther in this passage here? Verses 8 through 11 are some of the verses that we've got to look at and go, okay, maybe all the things that I learned in my kids' Bible class growing up are not exactly right about Esther. Let me say one other thing before I give some details on this. We have to remember that Esther is a victim of human trafficking here. She's going through extremely difficult circumstances. At the same time, it doesn't appear like she's reacting to all of these things the way that she ought to. Does that mean that God won't use her? Does that mean that she won't grow? Doesn't mean those things. But think about some questionable things that are happening in this text. And this one's a little bit more of a question mark. What's she doing eating the Persian food? Now, maybe it was kosher, but does that contrast to Daniel in Daniel chapter 1 when they were in exile and they refused to eat the food that was given to them? Or maybe that one's we're not sure exactly if this food is kosher or not, so let's get to one that's a little bit more concrete. In verse 10, she's been told by Mordecai to keep silent. Contrast that again with Daniel and his friends. Were they silent about being Jews? Were they silent about being worshipers of Yahweh? Some people have tried to read into this that there's good reasons that she had for being silent, and there's times that we should be silent today about our faith. And I don't think that you can really do that with a passage like this. Why would Mordecai urge her to do this when at this point in the book there's no threat to the Jewish people? And here's a third thing that's concerning, is intermarriage. Esther is headed towards marrying a pagan king, and what's happening with the Israelites living in Jerusalem at the same time? The problem was intermarriage, and people had to separate if you go read Ezra 9 and 10. Now, I'll quote to you an Old Testament scholar named Robert Alter on this. Mordecai does not hesitate to send his adoptive daughter to the king's bed. That is clearly the culmination of the selection process for the new queen. Perhaps this quote is a little strong. We know that in verse 11, Mordecai keeps checking in to see how she's doing. Maybe it's one of those things that his hands are tied. She was taken. I just want to know that you're doing okay. But we don't see him trying to encourage her somehow to sneak away or get out of this situation, which, by the way, compare that again to Daniel and his friends. Were they willing to die for doing the right thing? These things are at least questionable. And they should at least cause us to ask ourselves, is the way that I've heard the book of Esther growing up, is this totally accurate? She's a victim of human trafficking. She's in a difficult circumstance, no doubt. But the expectation in Scripture is that when our backs are against the wall, we're willing to die for our faith. Look at verses 12 to 14. And this horrifying procedure that these women had to endure. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the young women went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. This is disgusting, what we're seeing here. Step one of this beautification process and getting prepared to be with the king was 12 months, 6 months of oils and 6 months of other things to make sure that she smelled really good. You can imagine all the skin treatments. She's going to the spa for a year, and there might be a lot of women that thinks that sounds like a really great thing, but if you know what's at the end of all of this, it would be horrifying. Step two is she went into the king. Once again, Robert Alter says this: the selection process then comes down to trial by sexual intercourse. With which of these virgins will the king be truly satisfied? This man is ruining the lives of all of these women. Because you know what step 3 is for these women? Is they had to live the life of a concubine now in verse 14. Did you notice very carefully what verse 14 is saying? That after that woman would spend that night with Xerxes, that she would then return to the second harem. What? There's 2 harems. What are the 2 harems? In this chapter, we see that one harem is the harem of the candidates that the king has not been with yet, and Haggai rules over that harem. And then there's the harem of the concubines, which would be lower class wives that he could be with whenever he wants, and Shashgaz rules over that one. Do you know what verse 14 is showing us? The night with the king makes that woman a concubine, which means they slept together. Esther is the only woman in this competition that's named. How many women are not named that have to endure this terrible process? And their lives are ruined after this, where their opportunity to go and marry somebody else is ruined because they're confined to the harem of the king. Again, do you understand how when you're self-centered, how many people you destroy and ruin and hurt? As we would expect, Esther is made queen, though. Look at verses 15 through 18. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all the officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. All right, so here's Esther's turn. And when we had talked about this second step, she went into the king. Did you notice that in verse 13 she could take whatever she wanted from the harem and then go and try to... Well, what does that mean? I take it that there would have been a selection of a bunch of cabinets that had all kinds of necklaces and jewelry and clothing, and they'd be able to pick whatever they wanted to try to go and impress the king. Hegai, being a servant of the king, would know exactly what Xerxes would like, and she just listens to whatever he says, and she does that, and Xerxes falls head over heels for Esther. Now, the text is kind of veiled, but we know what happened. We've already seen what the procedure was in the previous texts. And by the way, again, Esther is going through a difficult circumstance, but has the book of Esther already shown us that a woman can stand up against the king? Didn't Vashti do that in chapter 1? Esther, you can do the same thing. The Lord's still going to use you, and he's going to weave together a beautiful story. But I've read commentaries on the book of Esther that have looked at this text as some kind of great celebration, like a Disney movie. And here she is, and it's like Miss America, but it's Miss Persia. And look at, she won and all that. Look at what Tremper Longman says about this. Although many commentators glamorize Esther's Cinderella-like rags-to-riches story and imagine that all the girls want to be queen, it is important to pause and reflect upon the sexual violation of the voiceless girls herded into the king's harem, where they were cared for by men whose boyhood castration signified another form of sexual violation. This is horrifying. This is not something to celebrate in this book. But we have a God who can work through ugly circumstances. We have a God that can take horrifying things that happen in our life, and he can even take us when we don't always react the way that we ought to react to difficulties, and he can create something beautiful. And what he's doing in Esther is he's going to use Esther to save all of the Jewish population from which Jesus eventually comes. Now, when Esther marries her, he throws this great feast for everybody. At the end of chapter 1, there was this great warning. All you women in Persia, you better honor your husbands. And then, of course, that made them all honor their husbands because you need laws to do that sort of thing. And now he sends out another notification to everybody. Remission of taxes. Everybody, everything is great now in Persia. We've made Persia great again. It's really awesome and all this sort of thing. And I'm really happy. Can you imagine living in Persia and you're not happy unless the king is happy? At the end of chapter 1, terrible edict goes out. In chapter 2, happy edict goes out. This guy seems bipolar. Can you imagine the skittishness of having that guy rule over you? Are we going to be happy right now, or are we going to be sad right now? And we serve under King Jesus, who will give us an eternal feast where we're always going to be blessed in his presence. But here's Esther being selected to be the queen. Now, this chapter ends with something that seems totally unrelated to everything we're looking at. But once again, this theme of God taking difficult circumstances, taking seemingly meaningless instances in our life, and then working towards something. This section that we're about to read will not matter until chapter 6, but the Holy Spirit decided to give us this section at this part of the book. Let's read what happens at the end of this chapter, starting in verse 19. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. All right. What's happening here is the setting of this is that the virgins are gathered a second time in verse 19. Well, when were they gathered the first time? I take it that it would have been when all the virgins were gathered initially to Susa, the citadel, to do this selection process. They're gathered again, but the text doesn't say why they're gathered. I take it, and there's different ideas on this, but I take it that they're gathered again now that Esther is the queen. They're gathered again to say, okay, you can all go home. You're not part of this beauty competition anymore. Perhaps this is a merciful thing that's happening here. Either way, there's a lot of commotion going on. And Xerxes has got some guys that check the doors, and like they're like the bouncers of the king's palace. And they start coming up with a plot on how to murder Xerxes. They're angry with the guy for some reason. And by the way, this is how Xerxes eventually dies in 465 BC, but it's not going to be in this instance. Eventually, there's going to be some people that do assassinate him. But Mordecai somehow catches wind of this plan, and he makes it known to the people that are higher up and to Esther, and she lets everybody know. And these guys are hanged on gallows. Now, the Persians historically were people who invented the earliest forms of crucifixion. And back then, they would have, here's like a highlighter, okay. So if my hand is the person and this is the stake, they would have taken somebody's back and laid him on top of the stake like this. They would have like poked him in the back and then set up a stake in the ground, and they would hang there until they would die, which is very possibly what's happening here. As a warning to everybody else that you better not do that. Now, what's happening in this text, again, is not going to matter until chapter 6. Because it's not going to be until 6:3 where the king says, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And this is 5 years later. 5 years later, after Mordecai has saved the king, he's eventually going to be blessed for it. You know, we serve a better king. And if a wicked king like Xerxes is going to end up honoring somebody for saving his life, do you think a righteous king is going to honor us and remember us for the deeds that we seek to do for his glory? Reminds me of Hebrews 6:10. For God is not unjust. Have you ever noticed in this passage before that he uses the word unjust? For God is not unjust so as to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for his name in serving the saints as you still do. Your reward will fully come one day when Jesus returns. But if a wicked king will eventually reward somebody, how much more will a righteous king? Do you see how in both of these instances, how Esther is selected in this chapter, and then Mordecai saves the king, how as this story progresses, God is putting together a memorable, beautiful story. But right now in chapter 2, we don't know how it's going to end. In your life, you don't know how it's all going to end. And certain things in your life right now may not make sense. Certain things may seem like injustices. Certain things may seem like difficult circumstances. But if you continue to love the Lord and continue to try to do better every day, to do what He said, He will make your life beautiful. And we would need one another to help us with that. Whatever is happening in your life right now, do you trust and know that King Jesus provides and makes all things work for the good of those who love Him? Your job is to love God. You can't control your circumstances. But seek to love Him better and better every day and see what the Lord will do with you. We're about to sing a song, and this song is meant as an invitation for us to consider our own lives. Maybe in this lesson you've been pricked in your conscience that you've been more self-centered and you've hurt a lot of people. Maybe in this lesson you've not been trusting in God's providence and you've been trying to take things into your own hands. Let this be an encouragement to you right now to get your life right with God. If there's anybody here that needs anything, don't leave here without talking to somebody or coming forward while we stand and while we sing.